Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckham. When I first started this podcast, I did not realize that I would see patterns in the leadership principles and philosophies of the people that I've interviewed and talked to. But it's clear after having done this for over a year, we're in season 2 now, that leadership leaves clues, that there's patterns, that good leaders say the same thing. And I don't know if you had a chance to listen to my speech to the United States Air Force, but it's all about the 5 major principles of leadership that I've noticed that come up again and again from all these different leaders from all walks of life. The number one principle in that speech is good leaders are servants. They consider their job to serve the people that they lead. And my next guest, Kai Harris, is a servant-based leader if there ever was one. Kai is the executive director of the Freedom Project Network. The Freedom Project Network is a group of various support organizations, primarily in the South and the Mississippi area, that focuses on helping kids that need it, helping kids in high school, helping them get to college, all sorts of different support organizations. This is a phenomenal project that Kai is in charge of. He became the executive director in August of 2000. Before becoming the executive director, Kai was a teacher and advocate for educational equity. He was a football coach at a middle school. He played football and earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Grinnell College. And in his free time, he says he likes stuffing his face with food, spending time with loved ones, and rooting for his Atlanta sports teams. In any event, Kai and I talk a lot about the Freedom Project Network and what it means to be a servant-based leader. If there's anybody that epitomizes servant-based leadership, it's Kai Harris. I think you're really going to like this episode a lot. And now I give you the executive director of the Freedom Project Network, Kai Harris.
Hey, everybody. Brian Beckham. And I've got Kai, my good friend Kai Harris. Kai is the executive director of the Freedom Project Network. And before we get started, Kai, tell people what is the Freedom Project Network? What are you the executive director of?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Brian. Excited to chat with you, and hello to all of your listeners out there. The Freedom Project Network is a collective of youth empowerment organizations. They are all Mississippi-based, and they are all modeled after the freedom schools of the 60s. And so huge focus on youth empowerment via liberatory educational experiences, huge focus on grassroots community organizing, Mississippi history, civil rights history, and obviously, college access and persistence through all of those sort of learning experiences. So we have, within our network, we have 3 Freedom Project sites. So think of these as like place-based community centers, and they serve students from 7th through 12th grade. And so we have 3 Freedom Projects. The first one was founded in Sunflower County, Mississippi, in 1998. And then our second Freedom Project, our first expansion site, was founded in Meridian, Mississippi in 2014. And then we had another expansion site in Rosedale, Mississippi in 2015. So 3 Freedom Project sites total. And these are like local sort of community-based centers that students join as rising 7th graders, and they attend after school and during the summer through their high school graduation. And again, just a huge focus on academic enrichment, health and wellness training, character development, any and everything that really sort of helps students develop this toolkit to be leaders in their communities and in our world more broadly. And so we have these 3 Freedom Project sites, and then we have these 2 additional sort of programs that have an intentional focus on college access and persistence. So one is called Freedom Summer Collegiate, and this is a program where we recruit and train and fund doctoral candidates from universities across the country. They come and sort of design a summer bridge course that is, related to their field of expertise. They're then housed at one of our 3 Freedom Project sites and they teach a summer course that is really like a college immersion experience for our high school students. And then our high school students get a college credit for the completion of this course. So that's really cool that our 10th through 12th graders get this like really powerful college simulation, where the course is really sort of structured and facilitated just like a college class with the syllabi and, office hours, the whole nine. But it happens from the comfort of the Freedom Project, a place, that's like a second home to them. And then I think on the other hand, these professors get to come to the Delta, to Mississippi, and get sort of really immersed in that history and culture, and get to spend the summer at the Freedom Project, which is a really sort of moving experience for them as well. And then that second program, so that's Freedom Summer Collegiate. And then the second program is called the Alumni College Success Program. And basically that's sort of born in the spirit that once our students graduate from high school, we should be continuing to support them to make sure that they're successful throughout their college experience. And so once students from the 3 Freedom Project sites graduate and matriculate into college, they join these cohorts where they get weekly mentorship calls, they get access to mental health support, they get access to academic support, and they get a financial stipend throughout their undergraduate experience. And so if you have this sort of like chart in your mind, we have these like 3 Freedom Project sites year-round, 7th through 12th grade programming. And then we have these 2 additional programs that the students from the 3 sites participate in. That's the Freedom Summer Collegiate and the Alumni College Success Program I was telling you about. And that's the Freedom Project Network.
Nice. And most of this is in the Mississippi Delta region?
Yep. So Mississippi Delta, 2 of our sites are in the Delta. That's Sunflower County and Rosedale. And then we have the Meridian Freedom Project, which is not in the Delta. It's East Mississippi, right about an hour outside of Jackson, which is the capital city.
And why the Mississippi Delta? What is it in particular about the Mississippi Delta that the Freedom Project Network is focused on that area, Kai?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the history. It's a region that is very rich in history, both from a positive and a negative perspective. So it's one of the regions that has been historically marginalized, most significantly, I would say.
Yeah.
The hub of racial violence, the hub of segregation and racial oppression, but also the hub of some really powerful movements. And so, we had our 3 founders who you actually know pretty well, who founded the Sunflower County Freedom Project. They taught in Sunflower County. They were, again, like studying this history of civil rights and the Freedom Summer movement, the Freedom School movement of the 60s, and thought this would actually be a really powerful model to apply for like a youth empowerment program in the 90s. And it's continued to sort of grow since then. So I think like it's those 2 things where on one side, it's a place that has this, really challenging history of racial violence, racial oppression, but it's also on the other side of the coin, a region that has a really powerful history of local grassroots community organizing. And so, folks like Bob Moses, folks like Fannie Lou Hamer, folks like James Chaney, these are local folks who really were sort of like drivers of the civil rights movement as we know it. And so sort of we think that grounding our students in that type of history can be really powerful.
Give us a little mini history lesson for people that aren't familiar with the original Freedom Project, or when I think of it, I think of freedom riders and things like that, and freedom marches. But give us for those of us who are not as familiar as others with the history of the civil rights movement, and particularly the history of the civil rights movement in the South and in Mississippi, give us a little. So when you're talking about using that as a model for today, tell us what you mean by that. Tell us what back in the 60s, what were people doing in the South and in Mississippi to advance the cause of civil rights?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there was a little bit of everything going on, and that could take our whole time. But just to sort of give you sort of a more specific timeline, you had SNCC and COFO, which were your major sort of organizing, I don't know, like arms of this movement. And again, I think Mississippi was sort of chosen as ground zero for this work in the 60s because of, it being really the hub of a lot of the, segregationist movements, and, a lot of the racial violence and oppression that was going on. And so the model was that, okay, how can we, combat these issues? And the Freedom Summer movement was really born out of that. And what Freedom Summer was really about was to attract volunteers from all over the country to come to Mississippi and lead like a massive voter rights push for the summer of '64. And so I guess like you can think of the program that was sort of meant to facilitate that work was then your Freedom Schools, which was, again, like if you think about it, it's like, okay, well, what are the major barriers to access to voting? A lot of it stems from education and from, folks not being empowered to vote, all of the sort of poll taxes and literacy tests and all of these systems and structures that were put in place to prevent folks from having access to voting. And so it's like, okay, well, if you want to come down to the rural South and like lead a massive voter registration or voter rights push, then underneath that is like this huge movement to improve education as well in those areas. And so then if you sort of take that a step further, it's like, well, the problem with public school education is that the curriculum was designed to reinforce, white supremacy in a lot of ways. And so, students from Mississippi were, encouraged not to question or interrogate systems in public schools. And that's the type of thinking.
Isn't that bizarre? Isn't that, Kai, not to interrupt you, but isn't that totally bizarre? I mean, I thought the whole purpose of the education system, or one purpose, is to teach you to think independently, to ask questions, not to take everything at face value. And we look back on our history like you're talking about, and there were systems in place, still are, frankly, that do the opposite. I mean, they were back then, they're saying, don't question this. This is the official history. Don't question the official history. And it turns out, the more we mature as a country, more we mature as human beings, that a lot of this history is just either half-baked or it's false or it doesn't tell the whole story. But isn't that interesting that back in the 60s and 70s, the education system, it's the very system that's designed. Yeah.
And I mean, and it makes sense when you think about it, right? Is because, what happens when those light bulbs start to go off in young people's minds and they start to interrogate these systems, then they want to rise up for change, right?
Exactly. And the people, and the people that are in power and have been in power historically are scared to death of that. They don't want people asking questions. They want people dumb, fat, and lazy. Just do what you're told, right? And so, we're sitting here now, and I'll tell you, this is a really timely podcast, Kai, because literally today, as we're shooting this podcast, we have a big election in Georgia. And there's been all sorts of issues with voter registration, voter rights, removing polling booths, primarily from African-American communities, trying not to trying to make it so where people can't vote, make it harder to vote. And I'm here to tell you that I don't care what your political persuasion is. If you're trying to make it harder for people to vote, you're not a very good American. You're a bad patriot. You do not support democracy. You support something else maybe, but we should be making it as easy as possible for people to vote. But so isn't it interesting that, the history repeats itself? We have these same issues that we had back in the 60s going on literally as you and I sit here talking today.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's true. And I mean, that is the point of the Freedom Project, is to really empower students to interrogate the systems that govern their communities, that govern our society at large. And then from there, we've sort of done our job, right? Like once we, give students an opportunity to really sort of interrogate the way things work, then they become hungry to, be on the front lines for driving positive social change. And then from there, it's just a matter of giving them a platform to do this, that. So, that's what the Freedom Project Network is all about. And that, like, the issues, while they are largely similar, to your point, they look slightly different for our students today.
Sure.
But that, like, this spirit of youth leadership, youth empowerment, and that being a means to driving the type of structural, sustainable change that we want to see in our communities and in our world. That's what we believe. And so that same sort of model and spirit is what we use with our students today.
Nice. And Kai, I think it's fair to say, tell me if I'm thinking about this correctly, the kind of the fundamental driving force or the real focus of what your work is education. It's about educating people, making them smarter people and better citizens. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And I think, like, education has, like, much more of a holistic term too.
Yeah, sure.
Not about, digesting information to, like, regurgitate it on an assessment.
Yeah.
Education in the forms of agency, in that, like, you have agency over your own learning, you have agency over your own life choices. And, like, that really is, what we believe, that, like, education is the seed of freedom. And so, like, what's freedom? It's like the freedom to direct your own life and move the way that you want to move. And so, like, empowering students with the ability to do those types of things is what we think about.
That reminds me of what my dad used to. My dad was a single father. My mom died when I was 10, and my dad raised my brother and I from the time we were 10 and 8 by himself, basically. And he used to say, I will consider myself a success as a father if you guys graduate from high school and never move back in. and I think the point he was trying to make was he was trying to teach us to be self-reliant, to be able to stand on our own two feet. And like you're talking about, part of that is book learning, part of that is school learning, but it's got to be broader than that. You've got to teach people to be well-rounded, broad citizens who can stand on their own 2 feet. Well, Kai, before we go any further, because I have some really sharp, pointed leadership questions I want to ask you, and I think you're one of the best people I could think of to ask these questions. But before we do that, tell us briefly, how does Kai Harris become the executive director of the Freedom Project Network? Like, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? And how do you end up in this job?
Yeah, man. So it's funny that you brought up the election in Georgia. I am from Atlanta, born and raised. That's my hometown. Grew up there. Grew up on the south side of the city, so if folks are familiar with the Atlanta area, I'm from a neighborhood called College Park, just right near where the airport is. But anyways, I went to college at a small liberal arts school called Grinnell College. It's in the middle of an Iowa cornfield. But yeah, I think throughout my college experience, I really reflected on just how fortunate I felt to, be receiving a Grinnell College education, and just, thinking about, like, how I could use my education to, reinvest in communities of color, in the other young people who look like me, who, come from places like I do.
So you were already thinking about that in college?
Yeah, man. Yeah, all of my friends were, going off to grad school or taking their, corporate jobs, and I was like, I don't know if
guilty. Yeah, that.
Yeah. So, hey, I took the, broke route and ended up becoming a public school teacher. I joined Teach for America, and that's how I ended up in Mississippi. And so I ended up in Greenwood, Mississippi. Was an English teacher at a middle school there. Taught for 2 years. I was a football coach at my school.
You were a football player in college too, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, I played football my whole life. And my first years in the classroom and my first years not playing. So that was a real adjustment. I was,
Yeah.
running out on the field about to like tackle some little kids.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I fell in love with education, fell in love with like mentorship. But again, to like our earlier conversation, started feeling very frustrated with this sort of teach to the test culture, and sort of having my hands tied in a lot of ways to teach things that I felt weren't really empowering my students in a real way.
Yeah.
And sure, we can read these passages and talk about grammar and all of that, but like, what does that mean for you actually developing as a leader, and as a thinker? And so that started to become frustrating. And I was, like, how can I stay in this type of work, but do it in a way that gives me more autonomy, more flexibility, and like it feels real? Ended up finding out about the Freedom Project through the craziest thing. The woman who was the executive director at the Sunflower County Freedom Project at the time was the former women's basketball coach at Grinnell College when
Nice.
I was a student athlete there.
Nice.
What a small world, right?
Yeah, right.
So I randomly get a call from her telling me that she now lives in Mississippi and is running the Freedom Project. I sort of went and visited, and it checked all of my boxes, right? In terms of all the things, in terms of this concept of like liberatory education, this concept of like holistic youth empowerment. I was like, yes, sign me up. So I worked at the Sunflower County Freedom Project. I was a program director there. I did the college access and experiential learning role. So basically planning all the trips, doing all the college prep stuff. So anything that wasn't like core literacy work was like my sort of wheelhouse. Did that for a few years. Ended up, best job I ever had. Loved the Freedom Project, obviously, but was ready to get back to Atlanta. Again, this is home. My family's here. Came back to Atlanta, was doing recruitment for Teach for America, actually, for a couple of years here in Atlanta. Stayed in touch with my Freedom Project folks, and they had told me, hey, we're really investing in this network concept. We think you would be a great leader for it. And at the stage that we're in right now, especially with COVID, it's something that you could do remotely.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where I landed this past summer. And so the network is really cool because it's new in concept, right? And like the Freedom Project sites that I was telling you about, they have been around for a while. At least Sunflower has been around for 22 years now. Rosedale Meridian are coming up on year 5 and 6. But the Freedom Project Network is really sort of like in its fetal stages, but it's really exciting because the network is founded because we're like, okay, well, we got a model that works. We got a model that is like, we see that it's like scalable. And so having these freedom projects operate like independently really isn't like the most sustainable organizational model long term.
Love that. Love that. Yeah.
To sort of be the needle and thread that weaves all of our programs together. And so I think like externally being able to move beyond, oh, well, hey, we're Sunflower. Oh, hey, we're Rosedale. Hey, we're Meridian. To sort of come and say, no, we're actually a collective that's like doing this really powerful place-based, history-based work throughout the entire state. And that like we're looking to open more freedom projects in Mississippi or expand beyond Mississippi someday. So that's sort of the work that I get to lead and the story I get to tell.
I love that. I love that for a lot of reasons. You're talking about like this distributed network and the power of distributed networks. And I was a computer science major in college. I've been interested in networks and network computing since the early 1990s. And, that seems to be, I mean, if you couple, we've had this pandemic, so we've got remote work, so we've got to be distributed. We've got stuff like Bitcoin and blockchain. We've got distributed computing networks. We've got distributed companies. And so what you're doing is it's kind of the talk of the times right now. And when you talk about distributed networks, the great thing about distributed networks, I mean, you could even think of the United States as a distributed network in some ways, with each state being a node in the network. And
Mhm.
the beauty of that is, I mean, there's a number of things that are really incredible about distributed networks. One of the cool things about it is, if one of the nodes has a problem, it doesn't necessarily mean everything goes down. So and the other thing is you can experiment with different solutions in different places. So you may have one node of your network that can do a certain thing educational wise, and then another one try something different, and then you compare the results, and you end up iterating and making it better and better. And so, I think that's and one of the things I wanted to kind of ask you as quickly as I could, Kai, was this is a leadership podcast, and so I'm really interested and have been interested in for a while some the fundamental principles of what makes a good leader. And so you became the executive director of this very important organization in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so I was looking at that. I didn't realize that you had become the executive director in 2020. And I was like, I have to ask Kai, literally a brand new job in the middle, in an important job in charge of a lot of people, for an organization that has the well-being of young people as its mission. Tell us what challenges you faced as a leader uh, after becoming the executive director, literally in the middle of a pandemic and a shutdown. Like, what challenges have you faced, and what have you done to try to overcome them?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I think, one challenge that we faced as a network is, you know, specific to the pandemic, is that our work is after school and summer in nature. And
Yeah,
so I think like a major value add in the normal world of the freedom projects is that like it's supplemental to school in a lot of ways. And that
yeah,
like you go to school all day and you're sitting in your rows and the teacher's at the front yapping. But then you come to the Freedom Project and it's a totally different world where students are at the front of the room and we're going on trips and it's,
yeah,
it's a very different learning environment, right? Well, you transition to school in a pandemic and school now is sitting at home on Zoom all day.
yeah,
And so, how is the Freedom Project offering something that's different than that, where
yeah,
we can be in building? And that's been a challenge for us. And I think what I've been really proud of, to see happening at our sites, is us really leaning into that original history and spirit of being a community service organization, right? And
yeah.
so, we've started a major like community grocery program where our staff
Nice.
members are delivering food boxes to our students' homes,
Yeah,
doing porch visits, right? And so if you look at those old like Freedom School photos from the 60s, and you see volunteers like with their little herd of students in a dirt church parking lot, doing class in the folding chairs, like seeing our staff in action this fall brought me back to those like sort of images, seeing our staff members riding around with folding chairs and
yeah.
pulling up the students' homes and sitting out in the front yard and tutoring them with their schoolwork. So I think for us, we pivoted and sort of came to this realization that like, hey, we're really about meeting the needs of our students and filling in the gaps, in partnership with the resources that already exist in our communities. And so if students need additional tutoring, students need additional meals, that's where the Freedom Project is going to come in. So work has looked different, but I think like seeing our staff sort of pivot and do different things to meet the different needs of our students in the midst of all of this has been really encouraging.
And let me
Um,
ask you. Let me ask you this, Kai, because
yeah,
I don't want to speak out of turn, but at least in my experience, kids that come from less advantaged economic backgrounds have a different experience in particularly public schools than kids that maybe go to that live in areas that are more advantaged economically. So, for instance, when the quarantine happened, I live in a pretty wealthy neighborhood in Houston. I have 3 kids, or 2 of them in high school, 1 in middle school. It was no problem. We got plenty of room in my house, plenty of food. We got plenty of money for tutors, all that sort of thing. But for people that live in apartment complexes north of I-10, about 2 miles from me, and there's 10 people in one apartment, not having those kids in school is a major, major problem. Like, we have to figure out how to address this. So what challenges, because you guys focus on areas that aren't as advantaged economically, like what problems have you seen, and what have you guys done specifically to help out with the quarantine and the pandemic, and how this has really, really interrupted the kids' schooling? Like, how have you addressed, what are the problems you've seen, and how have you guys kind of addressed these problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think like first and foremost, virtual learning is a beast, and I think it's sort of the things that you talked about is first off like infrastructure, in that you know this pandemic has ultimately just exacerbated a lot of inequities that already exist.
For sure, for sure. I mean, remote learning is great, but you got to have good Wi-Fi and a computer to begin with, right? Yeah.
And so, even beyond a device, right? Like if you're in a community where, think about we're working with students in rural Mississippi,
Yeah.
where there's even beyond the access to internet service, there's like an infrastructure problem where like, we need better broadband.
Yeah.
And so like where's the 5G at from and all of those guys in like
you guys are on like 1G, right? You're on 1G. Everybody's afraid of 5G, and I'll bet you guys would take 5G in a heartbeat, right?
Right. So, I think infrastructure is a huge part of it. Our teachers have the resources to like effectively replicate their lessons in virtual spaces?
Yeah.
Not often. And then, the food crisis and food insecurity is a whole other piece. But so, and then you think about, it's a generational sort of issue as well. Are parents in a position where they can help students with schoolwork or, offer additional tutoring and those types of things. So again, these were problems that like always existed. I think the pandemic has just like exacerbated them in a lot of ways. And I think like for me, it's even worse, when you compare like an urban area to a rural area. And so like with our student demographic, there's like this whole other additional layer to the inequity, which is that we're in these rural remote areas where these, sort of situations are even more exacerbated.
So talk about that a little, Kai, because I think there'll be a lot of people that will understand in less economically advantaged places in the cities how there might be issues. But talk about when you say there's this other layer of hurdles when you're in a rural area. What do you mean by that? Like, why are the rural areas even more difficult sometimes to deal with?
Well, I mean, it's just an infrastructure problem in a lot of ways, So, I mean, you think about, access to, funding. Obviously, there's gaps there. You're thinking about, access to these types of, when we talk about like Wi-Fi access, and again, we talked about just like the infrastructure problem where even the folks with the most wealth in rural communities still have connectivity problems because of just infrastructure problem in the region. Again, like with it just being remote, transportation adds a whole different layer to it, right? Like, folks needing to travel places with, folks are living in food deserts, which is a whole other element. And so I think this idea of access where even if you had the funds, the things that you need access to don't even exist in the community. I think that adds like an additional layer to all of these problems.
One of the things, and I don't want this to come off sounding the wrong way, but one of the things that I've thought about for a very long time, and I don't want to sound critical of Bill Gates or people that give money for malaria projects overseas or stuff like that, but we have a lot of issues in our own country. And one of the things that I've been interested in for a while is focusing on helping people that are as close to you as you can. In other words, start in your own community and kind of go out from there. So talk about what it's like for you and the people you work with to really focus your efforts, your service efforts on communities that you're close to.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really exciting about and what's unique about the Freedom Project Network is that the work is so place-based,
Yeah.
and that everything that we do is sort of traceable back to, again, these original movements in the same communities that were modeled after. And so I think that's sort of like what keeps us grounded, is that the whole sort of spirit and vision of our programming is modeled after these really powerful movements, local movements in the communities that we serve. Um, and I think what's unique about that is, and we talked about this earlier, is we was talking about like the cool thing about a network is how things can be slightly different across different nodes. And I think like that's what's really a priority that we have, is that, we have this same sort of general programmatic model, but it's not standardized, right? And that like what's happening at the Rosedale Freedom Project is in like direct response to the needs of the Rosedale community.
Yeah,
Which could
exactly.
be different to what the needs are in the Sunflower community or in the Meridian community.
Exactly.
But overall, we're still committed to these same sort of guiding principles and goals. I think that's something that's really cool and unique.
Let me circle back. I should have done this earlier, but let me circle back because I left a subject that I wanted to explore a little bit more in depth. I left it not explored as much as I wanted to. So when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, I was playing basketball at A&M, and I was thinking about drinking beer, chasing girls, and playing sports. That was basically my thought process. And then when I went to law school, where I met some mutual friends of ours, Greg Costas, Sean Raymond, terrific guys, I was focused on getting a big corporate job and making money as a lawyer, right? And it wasn't until I was in my maybe mid 30s, late 30s that I finally realized, hey, dummy, it's not all about you. It's really your life is about what you can do for other people. And what I also found out, Kai, is not only is it a better way of living to focus on serving others, but I actually feel better personally when I'm doing stuff for other people as opposed to when I'm doing it for myself. So my question for you is, was it your parents? Was it something about your upbringing? Can you even put a finger on why it was that you were focused from such a very young age on, like you said, becoming, I mean, my dad was a public school teacher after the military, so I know public school teachers don't make a lot of money. But why, what is it, do you think about your background that you were so focused from such a very early age on doing stuff for other people as opposed to what a lot of us do, me included? What can I do for myself?
Yeah, man. Well, for most of my childhood, I grew up, in a single parent household. Um, and so, I watched my mom, you know, go above and beyond for me, the priority that she put on education. And, so watching her, you know, make all the sacrifices that she made to make ends meet for us, but also always having a premium on education and like all focusing her energy on me in terms of making sure that I was getting the most out of my education. And knowing that, there are a few mentors who I had in my life. I participated when I was in high school in a program very similar to the Freedom Project in terms of, youth empowerment for young men of color. And like I said, it was those types of experiences that allowed me to be fortunate enough to end up at a place like Grinnell College. Yeah. And there were so many of my friends, relatives, who were just as talented, just as capable as me, that didn't end up in places like Grinnell College because they didn't have, the type of parental support that I did, or, to be fortunate to get in these couple little leadership programs like I did. And so again, I went throughout my college experience and sort of, as I just saw how that experience opened so many doors for me, to travel and to, get this really rigorous education, and like see all of these like professional opportunities start to present themselves for me. And I don't know, I just was like, the best thing that I can do with this blessing is to reinvest it in other people who have the potential, who's got the chops. They just need somebody, that's going to shepherd them through and sort of help them realize their full potential. And again, help empower them with the mindsets and skills to make the most of their potential. And like, yeah. So I don't know. I just went through my college experience feeling really fortunate. In addition to, drinking a few beers and chasing girls, I always found myself feeling really fortunate to be in that place, and to quite frankly, have a lot of peers who, were coming from very privileged backgrounds. Yeah. And so there was little old me, from the south side of Atlanta who was in that space. And, once I found my footing, was killing it on that campus and was like, that means every other kid from the south side can do this too.
For sure.
They just need, an opportunity to get here. And so expanding opportunities for folks, to realize their full potential was just like something that I was passionate about. And yeah, that's what led me to it.
Can I make a little editorial comment here? Would you mind if I made a little editorial comment?
Go for it.
So I've been thinking very hard for a year about what is wrong with the country right now. Like, it's clear there's something fundamentally askew, and I'm trying to figure out like how we get things back on track. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is exactly what we're talking about here. I think there's a dichotomy in the country right now between people and leaders that's all about me. What is it? What's in it for me? Well, how does this advantage me? How is this going to help me? And then there's another group who's about service-based leadership. How can I help other people? And I think that our ethics and our morals in this country have gone a little bit askew towards the me, selfish, what's in it for me? How can I pay as little taxes, make as much money, get all the benefit, blah, 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 all the way down the line. And so tell us a little bit about your thoughts on, because when I hear you talk, Kai, I think about all the people that you've already influenced in your life and all the people that those people will influence and that those people would influence, and like the effects that you're having and the Freedom Project Network is having on these young lives will ripple for generations. And I would argue that there's not enough there. You could make $50 billion and not have as much of an impact on these communities as you do if you just focus on helping young people and focus on teaching them how to, in turn, help young people. So talk a little bit about this idea of service-based leadership, how service-based leadership and impacting these young lives has such a big effect. And if you would, Kai, if you don't mind, I'm gonna give you a little direction on this. So I've been to a couple of the Sunflower Project and the Freedom Project fundraisers at Sean Raymond's house. I went to one, I think it was a year or two ago, and they always have a couple kids that have been through the program. And I'll tell you what, man, some of these stories of these kids will just blow your socks off. Like, these kids come from abject poverty, some of them, and they are some of the smartest, most well-spoken, driven, kindest people you'll ever meet. Sean will always bring a couple of the former students that'll come in and give a little speech. And so give us some specific examples if you can. You don't have to use names if you don't want to, but of some kids who've been through the program that have really had an impact on you.
Yeah. And I think, like, before I give you examples, I think like the way you just phrased it at the end was like what I was thinking about the whole time as you were saying the question is, I don't think of it as like service work. I think of it as, it's almost selfish in a lot of ways. And like, I get so much out of it myself.
Yeah.
So I think exposure is the key to all of this. And that works both ways, right? And that, like, you know, exposing our students to the realm of possibility is all you really need to do.
Yeah,
And that, you know, that sort of lights a fire in them
exactly.
to, you know, do what they need to do to achieve those types of things. And then vice versa, you know, it really is, you know, exposing folks to understand, you know, how much they really are privileged and like how much privilege has played a role in their own success. And I think like once you sort of are able to investigate that personally, it sort of creates this obligation to expand opportunities for those, right? And once you realize that it ain't really you that led to all of these, you know, fabulous things that you have, and that like, yeah, actually you ain't that different than this child who's growing up in poverty in Sunflower, Mississippi.
Yeah.
It's just that, like, because of the circumstances of your birth, you were blessed with all of these, you know, sort of menu of opportunities that made it easy for you to, you know, access all of these networks and all of these sort of spaces that provided more privilege for you, and on and on and on, and vice versa. When you don't have access to those spaces and those networks, then you make do with what you got.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you know, but you still, and it ultimately turns out to people being even more resourceful, even more, you know, creative and strategic minded. Is just applied to more of a survival context than, you know, what you need to have when, you know, everything's right here within arm's reach for you.
Yeah.
And once people see that, and you're like, oh my God, these are the most creative, resilient, brilliant young people I've ever met. Why the heck ain't they at Harvard and Yale and all these other places? And you say, oh my, you know, and you start to uncover these layers of, you know, systems that have like limited opportunities to some, and like overwhelming, you know, gave overwhelming opportunity to others. And then that sort of fury is what hopefully encourages people to want to contribute to this work and to this movement. But like specific students, I think like, you know, when I worked at the Freedom Project, again, you know, I think about, you know, how the Freedom Project is not easy. You know, we expect a lot from our students. It's rigorous. It's a significant time commitment. And so I think the level of commitment that our students demonstrate. So you talk about, you know, man, when I was in college, I was just trying to, you know, fool around. How are you so busy thinking about helping other people? I have the same sort of thinking when I look at our Freedom Fellows. Where I'm like, man, like when I was in high school, you know, I was just out here doing me. Like y'all are out here not, you know, going to a full day of school and then committing to like a 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. program that's, you know, just as, if not more rigorous than what you're experiencing in school. And anytime all the other kids are on break from school and they on the couch kicking their feet up, eating chips, you know, y'all are riding with us on Freedom Project trips, going to other communities and learning about people and engaging with community leaders from all across the country. And so, you know, that level of commitment speaks volumes to our students' character, you know, their sort of dedication to their education. And I think my job then is to just show them that, like, hey, being willing to get on this bus and come to the Freedom Project after school and stay committed from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. and engage with us, like, those are the skills that like the leaders of the world have. You know what I'm saying?
That's right. That's right. That's
just
right.
being able to understand that, and like it ain't, you know, you already got it. You got it inside of you. And like your ability to commit to this work and to show up day in and day out when all the other kids are going home to play PS3, or guys, it's PS5 now. But you know, that and showing students like that's what it takes to be a leader. And that's what it takes to, you know, achieve your wildest dreams and to, you know, uplift your community. It's just that sort of discipline, that sort of, you know, dedication and commitment. And that's how you know, sort of advocate for yourself for greater access and for greater access for your community. And that's what we preach to our students, you know.
And you know that they get to see somebody like you too, from somebody that's from a similar area, not exactly the same area as rural Mississippi. Atlanta's not like rural Mississippi, but they get to see somebody who's been successful and seeing that, like you're saying, that just opens up all these possibilities in these young people's minds. And the other thing I'll say, Kai, is this is important for our country going forward. We have communities, and it's not just minority communities. There's communities in West Virginia of coal miners and stuff that are very, very poor. And I think we do these communities a great disservice when we're just focused on incarceration and punishment, and these communities, they're not doing what they need to be doing. We have so many young people in these communities that have so much talent, and it's not just academic talent, it's leadership talent, it's the ability to inspire people, it's discipline. And by doing what you're doing, we're basically making our country stronger and better. We're taking the people that have all they need is an opportunity. That's all they need. And I think there's a false notion sometimes that, oh, this is America, the land of the free, and everybody has the same opportunities. And that's simply not true. My kids, I can hire as many tutors as I want, and they can come over every night. They have more advantages than other kids. There is no question about that. And anybody who says otherwise is nuts. All these kids they don't need more opportunities. They don't need more advantages. They just need an equal opportunity, an equal playing field. And once you give these kids that equal opportunity, like you're talking about, I mean, imagine a 16-year-old poor kid from rural Mississippi hopping on the bus for 4 hours every day and going to participate in your programs. I mean, the amount of dedication, the amount of discipline that it takes to do that is remarkable. And these are exactly the kind of kids that we need to be given a leg up to, that we need to be given these advantages to. So talk a little bit about, because I want to look at this from a slightly different perspective. I want to look at this from the perspective of, we've got all these talented kids from all over the place. And if we could just give them the right opportunity and the right tools, we'd be better as a community, as a state, and as a country. Talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind, Kai.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, going back to this theme of exposure, is just, how can we collectively, we have a collective responsibility to do this work, right? And so it's not just, the people who have suffered from oppression can't be solely responsible for their own liberation,
Yeah,
right? And
sure.
so, like, how are the people who have benefited from privilege for generations, how are they making the commitment to expand access?
Yeah,
Like, that's the work that needs to happen, right?
yeah,
Like, I think about the racial reckoning that's happened, growing in our society,
yeah,
I'm like, hey, I know folks in my community that have been screaming out Black Lives Matter for as long as I can remember.
yeah,
But it wasn't until, young white college students start marching in the streets
yeah,
that all of a sudden everybody turns their lens to it, right? And so,
absolutely.
and again, going back to the civil rights movement, right? And that,
Yeah,
like, folks in rural Mississippi have been leading grassroots movement for decades. But when young white volunteers came from the North and ended up going missing, now all of a sudden all the news cameras are on what the heck is going on in the rural South, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so it is, how are folks who, the challenge is not, are our kids and our parents and our communities, are they going to step up and speak out and advocate for themselves? It is, how do, the folks who are living, in their happy bubbles, how do they put the fire on their behinds to, use their privilege and use their voices to advocate on behalf of the folks who have been marginalized?
And there's a great saying on that. My good friend Blake Sawyer, he was a Marine Corps combat officer. Now he's an entrepreneur. He said to me one time, we were talking about some of these issues, and he said, and I'll paraphrase it, I'll probably mess it up a little bit. Essentially, he said, these problems will not be solved until the people that are not affected by these problems are as concerned about the problems as the people that are. In other words, just like you're talking about, these communities have been struggling. These communities that are literally right next door to us, Kai, these are our communities, have been struggling for a long, long time. But what's changing now? Now the people that are not affected by this, the people that have the advantages, now they're starting to get worried about this. Now they're affected by it. Now, in other words, the way I look at it, there's a great saying by Dostoevsky. He said, "You can judge the ethics of a society by the condition of its prisons." And I think what he was saying by that, what he meant by that is, you do not judge our success as a country. You do not judge the United States of America's success by our most successful people. You judge the success of the American experiment by the people that have the least privileges and how we treat them. So speak to that a little bit, if you don't mind, Kai.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, it just goes back to like that all of this is not, it's intentional, right? And that
Yeah.
like none of this happened by accident. And
Yeah.
so these systems and structures that have been reinforced for generations to silence the voices of marginalized communities and to like continue the oppression of marginalized communities. And so it's a matter of like, how do you dismantle these systems, right?
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting to me is also like this idea that folks in marginalized communities, they know best what they want and what they need, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, they don't need folks to come in and save them, right? Like
Yeah.
they need, you know, platforms to, you know, for their voices to be heard themselves.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I tell folks all the time, if you want to see what like real youth empowerment work looks like and how that can be a catalyst for like real game changing in terms of sustainable social and economic mobility for communities, come on down to the Mississippi Delta and like we'll be glad to show you how we operate. We'll be glad to show you. And so, you know, that I think that's the thing is like how, you know, do we continue to shine a light on the work that's being done? How do we continue to elevate the voices, right? Like everybody wants to be on stage and on the microphone and getting their 10 minutes of fame, to, you know, that instead of like, how can I just lift you up to give you a platform?
Yeah.
And I think the more we can do that and just saying, you know, I don't have all the answers, but I have a platform and I want to use my platform to help someone else elevate their voice. And I think the more we do that, the more we open people's eyes, we open people's hearts, and we give people the opportunity to drive change, you know, in their communities and beyond.
Kai, that's the perfect segue for talking about how your network and how the various projects under your network are funded and what people can do that are listening to this podcast. Like if somebody's listening to this podcast right now and they're inspired, and by the way, I've been inspired repeatedly, you know, like I said, going to my good friend Sean Raymond's house and listening to some of these stories and seeing, you know, Greg Costa there and some of the other folks. It's just so inspiring. And so if somebody's listening to the podcast right now and they're inspired and they say, this is something that I can get behind, that I really want to support. What are the different ways that people can support your efforts and what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first off, obviously, we're a nonprofit network. You know, we're funded by individual donors and, you know, foundation funds, grant funds. And so, you know, if folks want to support this work financially, obviously, that would be a huge help. I can share with you like the link to our site. I'm sure you have that. Folks can donate online. Folks can mail a check. Folks can don't make a stock gift to us. So that's if you want to contribute financially. If you want to, you know, have a conversation with me to learn more about this work, I welcome that. So Brian, feel free to, you know, share my contact info with folks. And, you know,
the website, just for everybody who's listening, is freedomprojectnetwork.org.
Right. It's us. And we have a variety of different, you know, volunteer opportunities that come up throughout the year. Obviously, things look different in the COVID world.
Yeah.
But folks want to, you know, we love guest speakers. hey, if you're somebody that wants to come and, speak to our students and talk about your work or your experiences, we welcome that.
Nice.
We've had everybody from, authors to, different professionals or different people in politics who want to come and talk about their career journeys or, how their experience can be an inspiration for our students. Happy to set that up. And yeah, just follow us, connect with us, share it. I think like word of mouth is the biggest tool that we have. And again, so I appreciate you, Brian, for giving me this platform to share about our work. And so, if your listeners are hearing this and are like, ooh, I want to learn more, I think you've done your job. And from there, folks should contact me, folks should donate to us, and join this family. We call everybody who supports and follows our work a part of the Freedom Project family. And it takes a village to make things happen for our kids and for our communities. And so if you want to be a part of that village in any way, all you got to do is reach out, and trust me, I'll find a way to put you to work.
Nice. Well, Kaya, those are nice words that you just said, but I got to be honest with you. It's my privilege to have you on the show, and I can tell you, I've known Greg and Sean for over 20 years. We were talking about that a little bit before the podcast, and I first learned about Teach for America when I was in law school, and I found out that both Greg and Sean had done that, and I was like, man, that is super neat. And then I started going to some of the fundraisers and paying attention to what they were doing. And man, I'm just here to tell you, it's so inspiring. And one of the neat things about it is, unlike writing a check to some massive corporate charity where you really don't know what's going to happen with your money, and there's not like tangible things you could look at with your network and with the Freedom Project and some of the other projects underneath it. I mean, these are real kids, real people that you can see that your time and money has a real tangible impact on. I mean, these are human beings, and you can literally say, man, my money and my time helped this specific kid. And so for people that are listening right now, I'm just here to vouch. I've known two of the founders of this project for a very long time. They're wonderful people. If you are looking for a place to put some of your charitable contributions, or if you're looking for a place to contribute some time or some expertise, man, I can't think of a better organization than the organization you guys are running. I'm serious, Kai. I mean, it's just because, again, like I'm saying, I think there's something about starting your charitable and your relief efforts as locally as you can, and then kind of going from there. So anyway, anybody that's listening, is freedomprojectnetwork.org. You'll see all the information up there. Kai's on there, featured prominently. I've got Kai's contact information, so anybody that wants his contact information, contact me. I'll get it to you. But it truly is one of these organizations that just has the bang for the buck. The amount of impact you have for your dollar or for your time is so outsized that it's just, I don't like to think about this stuff as a quote investment in the economic sense, but an investment in the human sense. And if you're going to invest time and money, man, this would be something that would be awesome to invest in. So Kai, real quick, we went a little bit over our time. Do you have a couple more minutes? Because I have a few more questions I want to ask you before I let you go.
Yeah, man, I can't say no after you just gave that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess not. Yeah, you'd be kind of that'd be kind of a jerk thing to. No, I got to go right now. No, but seriously, I have a couple more questions for you. These are kind of broader questions that I'm just interested to hear what you have to say about. So, who are your personal heroes? Like, who are the people that you look up to? Who are your role models?
Man, that's a good question. It evolves. I don't know, man. If you ask me this question a week from now, you might get a totally different answer.
Yeah.
I think like and this is, I don't know, I don't mean to scare anybody, but like, I think like, radical people are like my role models. And not like radical from like necessarily like a political perspective, but I mean like people who, are ready to die about what they believe. And people who are ready to like, sacrifice everything for what they believe. And so, I think about people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who, is one of the like Freedom Project idols. I think about people like Stokely Carmichael.
Sure. Yeah.
These are folks who, were like young, and like, just were on a different wavelength in terms of like their priorities and what mattered to them. And were willing to go for what mattered to them at all costs. And I think like, I don't know, that's just like a way that I try to live my life, in that, young people have always been the forefront of significant social and political revolutions. Yeah. And so, I think there's always this, especially like when I think about stepping into this role as like a young man, I think there's always this sort of like, I don't know, this weird like imposter syndrome where like young people are like, do I belong in these spaces? Do I belong in like leadership? Or should I sort of step back and let more older people, lead the way? And I say, nah, young people should step up, and should speak up and use their voice, and use their energy and their passion to drive things forward. I think about like, I don't know where was it. I'm blanking on the like where it was, but when the school shooting happened in Florida, and like all those students, like led this major sort of activism movement, to combat, like gun laws and things. Like those are the type of folks who I consider like my heroes. And so it's not always like the people who you see on TV or in your textbooks. It's like the people who you don't necessarily hear about, but the ones who are day in, day out doing the work, and putting in that sort of blood and sweat equity, to drive the movement forward.
So you use the term radical, and there's some people that will be provoked by that term, but I would encourage people to think twice about that because, whether you're religious or not, Jesus Christ was a radical. He was a radical. What he was saying and preaching at the time was a radical thing to do. This country, our founding fathers, they were radicals, at least given the times. I mean, we literally went to war with the most powerful country in history at the time, Great Britain, based on a concept that we were not going to be governed by a king anymore, essentially. That was a radical idea. Martin Luther King, nonviolence, Gandhi, nonviolence, things like that. At the time, we don't appreciate that as much anymore, I don't think. But those are radical ideas. And so I've been thinking about this, Kai, a little bit as it relates to leadership. And like I said earlier in the podcast, one of the things that I've been really searching for, and it's been unbelievable for me getting to talk to all these people, military veterans, congressmen, sports stars, psychologists, doctors, lawyers, judges, people like you name it. I've been looking for commonalities, like common threads in leadership. And one of the big threads I think that I've seen in all these leaders is if you're just going with the flow, if you're a member of a tribe, whether it's a political tribe or some other tribe, and you're just doing what everybody else is doing, or thinking what everybody else is thinking, or doing what everybody else is doing, by definition, you are not a leader. A leader is an independent person. Leadership, by definition, requires you to step outside the status quo, to do things that other people aren't doing, just like you're talking about, to do things that are, quote, radical. But that's how things get done. Things don't get done by doing it the same way we've always done it. Leaders, if you want to be a good leader, then you don't want to be a member of any particular tribe, because that by definition you're not a leader, right? So that's great. I really like that. So okay, so we talked a little bit about your heroes and who you look up to. What are some of your favorite either books or movies or things of that nature that have inspired or influenced you?
Oh man, yeah, it's so funny because I always go back to like Mississippi stuff, man. So, I mean, if you haven't read, I've Got the Light of Freedom by Charles Payne. Like, I think that sums up everything that like sort of we believe and that like I believe in terms of community organizing. So that's a powerful book. And then like beyond that, man, I'm just like a huge like Black experience book type of guy. So a lot of Richard Wright,
Yeah, sure.
a lot of Jesmyn Ward, a lot of Ta-Nehisi Coates, and the list goes on and on from there. But yeah, those are like my major sort of book. And movies, let's think.
Have you seen the I think it's called The 13th on Netflix?
I was just about to say that.
Man, yeah. What a power. I've been recommending that to people for a year. I'm like, you have to watch this.
Yeah. There we go, Brian. There we go. Yeah. You stole it right out of my mouth. Yep. So highly recommend that. Again, it's just like, I'm a fan of, I think like I recognize, again, I go back to this concept of exposure in that like I'm passionate about these things and I, have the perspectives and opinions that I do because of exposure, because I spent all of my 20s in rural Mississippi, right? Teaching and education and doing this type of work with the Freedom Project. But if you didn't have those experiences, then like I can't fault you for, not necessarily having the same sort of lens that I see the world through. Yeah. And so that's why I always go back to exposure, because again, I think, something that I learned and something that I encourage people to do is, is pull people in, right? And so, instead of, I think like this whole idea of, like cancel culture, and like putting people on blast for, their ignorance. Yeah. A lot of times, I just don't think that's the most effective approach in that, like, so I appreciate that question, because I always say, when I come across someone who has like a very different perspective about things, that I feel like, basic issues of equity and justice that like any person, like decent human being should be aligned on. Yeah. My first reaction is, well, maybe I should recommend some reading or some watching for you to do. And if you still at that point have these same types of mindsets, then maybe you're just a fool, right? Yeah, but I think like giving people the benefit of the doubt, and sort of acknowledging, hey, everybody didn't spend, 5 years of their life, living and being immersed in, Mississippi civil rights history and youth empowerment work rooted in all of that, right? And so maybe if I've been climbing the corporate ladder all these years, then like, my lens that I view the world through is slightly different. And so I try to, I think leadership is, just like a space of humility, a space of being a facilitator. Those are the types of things I want to lean into, and how can I facilitate conversations that need to happen? How can I just create spaces for people to learn, either independently or collectively, and create spaces for people to, based on their learning, organize together. And it ain't about me, it's about me using my platform to create spaces for other people. And I think that's what leadership is.
Perfect. And one of the things, I'm about to release a podcast. This is probably going to be my favorite podcast because it's with my dad. But one of the things my dad says all the time is, you want to feel better about yourself, go to Walmart. And the reason he says that is because there's people of rich, poor, all different races, all different creeds, all different colors. And everybody, for the most part, gets along. Like people are fundamentally good people when they're face to face. It's all this online nonsense and social media stuff, and frankly, I think a lot of our political leadership that drives us apart. But when we're together, when you and I are sitting down over lunch and we're just shooting the bull, talking about how Dominique Wilkins was the best Atlanta
Come on,
basketball player ever.
now you talking my language, Brian. Now you talking my language.
Yeah. That, you know, then we're you know, and I tell people the way I describe it as a lawyer in a law firm is I've been doing focus groups for years. I hadn't been able to do them in person since the quarantine, but I get the most diverse group of people I can get, and we present these very challenging, emotionally charged cases to them, and we watch them deliberate and argue about stuff that is super emotional. And you know what I found? I found that the people that walk in there that you would think would not get along, they end up being like the best friends. Like, people are fundamentally good and nice to people as long as we give them a chance. It's like you just said, just because somebody doesn't think the same way I think or the same way you think, that doesn't mean they're not a good person. Maybe they just have a difference of opinion, or maybe they just haven't had the same experiences, or maybe they just haven't seen what we've seen. So Kai, that is I've taken, frankly, 20 more minutes of your time than I thought it would, but that's a good way, I think, to end it. I'm sensitive. I know you got a lot going on, but let me just make a couple comments before I let you go. So as I'm sitting here talking to you, one of the things that's kind of in the back of my mind, I think about my father. My father was after he was in the Air Force, was a high school teacher for 20 years. And he had so much impact on so many kids. I still get he's not on Facebook, so I get messages from some of his former students. Hey, do you have your dad's cell phone? And this is 30 years afterwards. He had such a big influence on me. And I just think I look at you and I hear you and I listen to you talk. And I just think about the amount of influence that you have had and will have on both these communities and on our country and our world at large, frankly. And I just want to say that I can't tell you what a great thing you're doing. How this positive influence, you'll have more impact, frankly, on the world, more of a positive impact than most of the rich lawyers I know, because what you're doing, like we were talking about, ripples. You'll have one group of students, then they'll have another group of students, and then another group of students, and it becomes exponential. So, man, I just want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. I think this country would be a lot better off, frankly, if we had more people like Kai Harris. So thank you so much, my man, for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate you giving me a little more time than we had budgeted.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. It's been a pleasure. And you know what? Don't thank me. Thank our students and their families and the communities that we partner with, for just allowing me to be a part of their lives, So I'm really fortunate and blessed to be able to do this work. It's not, like I'm making any sacrifices to do it. I'm the lucky one to be able to work with such a brilliant, amazing group of kids. So, thanks for giving me this platform, and hopefully everybody that's listening is like, I'm fired up. I'm about to donate and email Kai Harris tonight. That would be the biggest win. So appreciate you, Brian.
Perfect way to end it. Keep doing what you're doing, my brother. It's great to see you. Great to talk to you.
All right, man. Talk soon.